Hello everyone, I'm Cindy from Espressif documentation team. In this talk, I will share with you how to create awesome documentation for your ESP32 X using the doc package ESP Docs. Here are the contents. Firstly, I briefly describe 3 typical documentation in HTML at Espressif and what the most suitable doc generator to build them from the source format to the target format. Secondly, I will focus on explaining what is ESP Docs and its outstanding features. Then I'll talk how to build documentation locally and how to deploy the built documentation automatically to your server, such as your own server or GitHub pages. Let's start with a glance at the 3 typical documentation in HTML at Espressif. So the first type is a simple documentation that does not require advanced features, such as navigation menu, auto-generated table of contents, advanced cross-references. There are lots of such documentation both inside Espressif and outside Espressif. An example at Espressif is the ESP Docs documentation. So let's take a quick look. You just put some documents in Markdown format into a folder, and then the GitHub renders them for you into HTML. The second type is a more complex documentation that requires some advanced features, but does not generate documents for multiple products from the same source files. ESP-ADF is such an example. This type of doc is written in RST format, built by Sphinx into HTML or PDF, and then hosted on Reader Docs or RTD. Then we'll have a look at the ESP-ADF guide. So it has advanced features such as auto-generated table of content, index, cross-references, navigation menu, and etc. But if you need to develop an even more complex documentation that requires more advanced features and generates documents for multiple products from the same source files, such as ESP-IDF programming guide, then ESP Docs is your answer. This type of doc is also written in RC format, but built by ESP Docs into HTML or PDF and then hosted on Espressif server. Let's have a look at the IDF programming guide. Besides the advanced features provided by Sphinx, it also allows users to view target-specific documentation by selecting a target in the upper left drop-down menu here. This presentation focuses on the doc generator of this type of document, ESP Docs. And what is ESP Docs? ESP Docs is a Python-based wrapper for the documentation building package Sphinx. It is intended to simplify and extend Sphinx functionality to better suit what is needed for building documentation for Espressif development frameworks. It provides functionality for building documentation for multiple targets. The target in this presentation refers to the product, or more specifically, a chip series, such as ESP32 or ESP32C3, from the same restructure or RC source files. And it also provides Sphinx extensions used at Espressif and scripts for deploying docs. The diagram shows some key features or extensions of ESP Docs. Besides the functionality provided by Sphinx here, with ESP Docs, can also write documentation for multiple targets from the same source files with these 5 extensions. And you can also automatically generate API documentation with the 2 extensions Run Doxygen and include bit5. Besides, you can redirect HTML pages with this extension and link to code files of the same version as the documentation with the link rows extension. So in this talk, I will just cover this block and HTML redirect and link rows. First, writing documentation for multiple targets from the same source files. Let me first ask you a question. If you are going to prepare a big documentation, let's say hundreds or thousands of pages for multiple targets, or chips or other products, and the documentation for each target is quite similar to each other, with a large number of small yet important differences scattered throughout this documentation. Which of the following option would you choose? Option 1, prepare separate documentation for each target. So then there's our ESP32 programming guide, Espressif programming guide, Espressif programming guide, and X programming guide. Then once you need to do updates to the common part of documentation, you need to do it multiple times. And consistency among those documents will be a big headache. And the question is more ESP32 X coming? Definitely yes. Is more separate documentation coming? The answer should be, oh no. So I would say no to this option. So option 2, prepare a single documentation for all targets and list target-specific information one by one. For example, when describing the external SPI RAM for each chip, you need to do it for each chip one by one. So ESP32 is able to use up to 4 MB of external SPI RAM memory, and S2 blah blah, and X blah blah blah. So in this way, all chip-specific descriptions such as inline words, paragraphs, documents are all provided to customers, and those customers might be just interested in documentation for only one chip. What makes the situation worse is that more chips are coming, and the chip-specific descriptions will take much more space and distract customers even more. Then I have a question. Is it possible to combine the pros of the two options? So in other words, can we provide a single documentation for all chips without distracting users with irrelevant information? Answer is ESP Docs. With ESP Docs, you can prepare a single documentation for all targets and show target-specific information depending on the target customers select. For example, when ESP32 is selected here, only the common description and ESP32 specific information will show up. So how does ESP Docs achieve that? Then there comes the first block of features, writing documentation for multiple targets from the same source files. There are 5 extensions here. Format ESP target allows showing target-specific inline text, and list filter allows showing target-specific paragraphs, and top tree filter and exclude docs extensions allow showing target-specific documents. And this add warnings extension can warn customers the documents that are not updated yet. So that's basically all about the first block. Now let's take a look at the second block or second outstanding feature of ESP Docs, which is automatically generating API documentation using Run Doxygen. So this Run Doxygen extension runs Doxygen to process Doxy files and to generate XML files describing key headers, and then generate Ying files that contain brief directives. These Ying files can be included directly into API reference pages. So the Doxy files here contains a list of all header files we need to generate the API reference for. Let's take a look at the example. So the source file looks like this. You just use this directive include build file and explicitly declare what Ying files that you want to include. And then here's the rendered effect after the documentation is built. So the header file and then functions here. If you're writing documentation for multiple targets and you are using ESP Docs, then don't need to implement this step, because this feature is already bundled in ESP Docs. But if you're writing documentation for one target and don't want to use ESP Docs, but still you want this feature, you can prepare a script referring to GenDXD Python script. When you're writing code, you need to follow Doxygen style. And then you need to prepare doxy files referring to the files in the Doxygen folder for documentation with multiple targets, and referring to doxy files for docs with only one target. And then when writing doc, use the directive include build file or include directive depending on the documentation you prepare. The next extension is HTML redirect. So during documentation lifetime, some source files are moved between folders or renamed, and URL to these target files change as well. This extension allows users with the old URLs to be redirected to the new URLs. For example, if the folder Ethernet is renamed network, go to page redirect txt and redirect the files in this folder. So in this ESP IDF programming guide, we have a such file. So we add the following line: API reference Ethernet index and API reference network index. This is the original or the old URL, and this is the new URL. So after the documentation is built, the old URL will be redirected to the new URL. This is the old one, and this is new one. Once you click this link, you will be automatically directed to this link. Again, if you don't want to use ESP Docs but still want this feature, you could follow this section to implement in your own repo. You download this Python script to your documentation folder, and then in Sphinx configuration file, add HTML redirects to extensions, and then create a file with a list of redirects such as the page redirect txt in ESP IDF programming guide. And then in this redirect txt file, add the old and new URLs. The next extension is link rows. So this extension helps to link from documentation to the specific files and folders of the same version in project repositories. So in a later commit, when the files or folders in the repository are moved around or deleted, the links in documentation built upon the previous commits do not get broken. Let's say on January 1st, in commit A, I added the following hot link into a source document, and then doc A is built upon commit A. And then on January 2nd, in commit B, I moved the hello world folder, which means above hot link gets broken. So as a result, the above link in doc A gets broken. This is the case when we are using the hard link. But if the link row extension is implemented, on January 1st, in commit A, I added the following link row into a source document. So in source document, it looks like this. And then doc A is built upon commit A. In doc A, the link always points to the hello world folder of the commit A. And then on January 2nd, in commit B, I moved the hello world folder. The link in doc A actually is not affected and remains valid, leading to the hello world folder of commit A. So let me give you another example. In documenting code, this is a document. If you insert the source code below here, you will get a valid link pointing to the hello world folder of the same commit ID, even if the folder was deleted in master branch. It will still be directed to this commit ID. So the source looks like this, and the rendered effect is like this. And the actual plain link also points to the code of this commit ID, 997844B, the same as this one. Again, if you don't want to use ESP Docs and still want this feature, follow this usage section to implement it in your own repo. Write a similar script link rows to define the project files you want to link to, and in Sphinx configuration file, add it to extensions. For more information, just click this link files here. Then after we are preparing documentation in RST format, how to build it from the RST format into HTML. Here are the instructions. First, you need to install dependencies, Doxygen and ESP Docs. And then you need to build the documentation. First, you change directory to the documentation folder, and then you have multiple options to build the documentation. The first script or command line builds docs for all supported language and targets. And the build docs target ESP32 language English, build docs for the ESP32 target in the English language. And build docs fast speeds up documentation by excluding Doxygen generated API docs. So for more options for building documentation, just click this link. Okay, so then building and deploying documentation automatically with CI or continuous integration. The whole workflow is you prepare some RC files and GitHub continuous integration or CI builds the documentation using ESP Docs into HTML, and CI again deploy the build documentation into a hosting site. Currently, documentation built with ESP Docs can be hosted on your own server and GitHub pages. This table provides example documentation, deploying configuration examples, and some reference materials on how to automatically build and deploy the documentation with CI. So that's basically about how to build and deploy documentation automatically. To sum up, what we covered in this talk is some outstanding features of ESP Docs. The first one is how to write documentation for multiple targets from the same source files, and then how to automatically generate API documentation. And lastly, two very useful extensions, redirect HTML pages and the link documentation to the folders of the same commit or same version. And then we talked about how to build the documentation locally, and then how to build documentation automatically with CI, and also deploy the build documentation into a server. So that's basically all about this talk. Thank you for watching.